on the board so that you can match them. Okay. So now that I've got these all notched, right? I'm actually going to put a little hole through the apex too, just so I know where it is on the other side. Okay. I'm not going to circle that in red. I'm just going to kind of mark it and label that that's the apex because I don't want whoever's sewing from here to go poke a hole through the apex, right? All right, so I'm going to open up my pattern. I'm going to do the same thing with the vanishing point too because I've got to draw the lines on both sides. So I'm going to open up my pattern.
Can we label it apex?
Absolutely. I'm going to encourage you to label everything. Okay. I'm also going to encourage you to label those measurements. Remember we wrote on our muslin bust depth. Write bust depth on there. You know, what were those measurements? So every time you go double check, you don't have to go to page 17. They're here, right? Label them. What else needs to get labeled on this pattern? Well, yeah, we need to know what the pattern is called, right? What else do we think we need?
Oh, grain line.
Grain line, right? We were so careful about putting a grain line on our muslin in the first place. It would all get wrecked if whoever's cutting and sewing it didn't bother with the grain line, right? Now, yes, we are all going to be sewing our own stuff in here, but in the industry, that's not really what happens. Usually there's a designer that comes up with the idea and hands it off to a pattern maker who makes the pattern, who hands it off to a cutter who cuts it out, who hands it off to at least a sewer. Sometimes it's 8 or 9 sewers. Maybe there's one person that only does collars and one person that only does waistbands and one person that does darts. So we need to be clear with our markings because this is, unless it's just your own project, is going to go through and travel through many hands. The staple remover is helpful. I just never know where mine are. All right. All right, so I've got my full pattern here. While it's open, I'm going to say, before I forget where that mark is, I have an apex on that side too. I have a dart on this side too. But now I've got my dart legs notched and I have a little punch hole up here so I can just connect the dots. I could go in and draw my side seam. I could go in and draw my shoulder seam. I could go in and pivot along that edge and draw in seam lines. I don't really need to. The notches are letting me know where those seam lines are. But I do like to have a dart drawn in so they know it's an actual dart as opposed to some other thing. And then I would be circling this 1/2-inch punch hole in red. Now as far as grain lines go, if I have a full pattern piece like this with the center line drawn in, that can be my grain line. That's a perfect place for a grain line, and that's where we're going to put our grain lines on full fronts. Or if it's a full back, it would be just wherever there's a center line. Okay? So I already have a line drawn in. The way we're going to indicate that this is a grain line is we're going to be putting arrows on it. The arrows mean this is a grain line, pay attention to me, make sure that the pattern gets put down on the fabric parallel to the selvage. So I'm going to use the corner of my ruler, and we're going to have nice big arrowheads. These arrowheads are going to be 1/2 inch long on each side. So if I line up my ruler on a diagonal, so do you see how I'm lining up a corner and this kind of 1-inch mark and the 2-inch mark up here? If I line this up so my ruler is on the bias, and I trace along 1/2 inch here and 1/2 inch here, this is the size grain line I want. Nice big arrowheads. And I'm doing it about 1 inch away from each seam. I've had people turn in stuff with a grain line and these tiny, teeny, tiny, cute little arrowheads, and nobody's going to see what those are. Okay, we're in production here. We want to make 1 million of these. Nobody wants to have to like argue about where that grain line is. Let's make them matter. Let's make them count. Okay, so that there's a line. I have an arrow on either end. The arrow on either end means I'm able to cut this both directions. On a solid fabric, I would be able to cut this either that way or that way, and it would look the same and behave the same. If I have something like a velvet where the pile of the velvet kind of leans one direction, if I cut velvet going one way, it'll look really rich and dark and lustrous and mysterious. If I cut it the other way, it'll be flat and shiny kind of looking. Nothing worse than cutting one side one way and the other side the other way, right? In that case, you would put an arrow going one direction so they know we only need to cut this one direction. If this print has human beings on it, right? We don't want the human beings to be on one direction on
Or lines.
right? So if it's a one-way print or a one-way type of fabric, we would put an arrow saying which way is up. Okay? But if it's something like this or an all-over print where the flowers look good both directions, we're going to put an arrow going both directions. Okay? So start on the bodice. I'm going to do my back bodice and then I'll pull you over when something matters. Okay? But the back bodice gets marked in the same way. I'll call you over when it gets a little